It did not begin with love. It did not even begin with a fight. It began with silence. A private jet, somewhere above the clouds in 2016, carrying one of the most powerful families in Hollywood. No cameras, no headlines, just tension thick enough to feel. Voices were raised, emotions spilled over. Children were there. And whatever happened in those hours did not stay in the air, because within days, a decision was made that would shatter an empire the world believed was untouchable. For years, they had been more than a couple. They were an idea, a symbol, a carefully constructed image of beauty, power, purpose, and control. The kind of story people wanted to believe in. The kind of love that looked too strong to break. But something inside that plane changed everything. And the most unsettling part is this. The public never truly saw it. What leaked out was fragmented, reportedly intense, deeply personal, investigated but never fully resolved in the eyes of the public. No clear answers, no complete truth. What followed was not just a breakup, it was a slow unraveling. Legal battles stretching across years. Allegations met with denials, silence where there should have been clarity, and a narrative that kept shifting depending on who was telling it. The headlines came fast, but the truth stayed buried under layers of reputation, power, and carefully worded statements. Because when two people like this fall apart, the story does not end. It fractures, it multiplies, it becomes something harder to define. And maybe that is the real mystery here. Not just what happened on that plane, but what had been building long before it ever took off. Then came the version of the story the world thought it understood. Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt were not just celebrities, they were a phenomenon. The kind of couple that did not just appear in headlines, they dominated them. Every red carpet felt like a coronation. Every photo looked intentional, almost too perfect. 6 children from different parts of the world, a global family that seemed to stand for something bigger than Hollywood itself. He was the golden boy who had it all: charm, legacy, effortless appeal. She was something else entirely: controlled, intense, unreadable. A woman who carried both danger and discipline in the same gaze. Together, they created a narrative that was impossible to ignore. Not just beauty, but purpose. Not just fame, but meaning. Humanitarian missions, political influence, films that blurred the line between art and message. They did not just live in the spotlight, they reshaped it. And the world bought into it completely, because this was not just a relationship, it was a brand, a symbol of evolution, of redemption, of two people who had seen darkness and somehow built something stronger out of it. People did not just admire them, they believed in them. But here's where it gets uncomfortable. The stronger the image, the more pressure it hides. The more flawless the surface, the more it demands control behind the scenes. And sometimes perfection is not real. It is managed, maintained, protected at all costs, because what the public saw was unity, stability, strength. But what they didn't see was everything it took to keep that image alive. But that's only part of the story. At first, nothing looked wrong. That is how these stories usually begin. Not with chaos, but with control. With smiles that last just a second too long. With interviews that say everything and nothing at the same time. When Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt first came together during Mr. and Mrs. Smith, the narrative was explosive. Passion, chemistry, controversy. It felt dangerous, and that danger made it irresistible. But beneath that intensity was something else, something quieter, something harder to define. Because this was never a simple relationship. From the outside, it looked like evolution. Brad Pitt stepping away from a safe, predictable life into something deeper, more meaningful. Angelina Jolie, the once chaotic outsider, now building a family, a purpose, a structure. It looked like balance, like they completed each other. But balance can be an illusion. There were early signs, small enough to ignore but sharp enough to matter. Their personalities did not just differ, they collided. Jolie was known to be intensely controlled, deeply intentional, always thinking several steps ahead. Pitt, by his own later admission, was drifting, searching, trying to understand who he was outside of the roles he had been playing for years. That difference does not explode overnight, it builds pressure. Interviews from that period carry a strange undertone when you look back. Pitt talking about feeling stuck before meeting Jolie. Jolie speaking with a kind of emotional precision that felt almost guarded. They were aligned in public, but internally they were moving at different speeds. Then there was the family, 6 children, different backgrounds, different needs, a life that required not just love, but structure, discipline, constant decision-making. And here's where the cracks start to show, because raising a family like that is not just emotional, it is logistical, philosophical. And according to some reports over the years, their approaches were not always the same. One leaned toward control and protection, the other toward freedom and fluidity. Neither is wrong, but together they create friction. And then there's fame, not normal fame, global, relentless, invasive attention. Every move documented, every expression analyzed, every silence turned into speculation. Imagine trying to hold a relationship together while the entire world watches, waiting for it to break. Because pressure does not destroy instantly, it erodes, slowly, quietly. At the time, no one called it a warning. No one saw it as the beginning of something unraveling. It just looked like 2 powerful people building an extraordinary life. But looking back now, those small differences, those quiet tensions, they were never small. They were the beginning.
For nearly a decade, they managed to hold it together. Not perfectly, but convincingly. Appearances were maintained. The family grew. The image stayed intact. And in 2014, they did what many thought would solidify everything. They got married. It should have been the moment that locked the story in place. The confirmation that everything they had built was real, stable, unbreakable. But sometimes a marriage does not fix anything. It reveals everything. Because once the label changes, so does the pressure. Expectations shift, roles harden. What used to be flexible becomes defined. And for 2 people already carrying so much weight, that shift can be dangerous. Behind the scenes, things were getting heavier. Brad Pitt would later openly acknowledge his struggles with alcohol. Not rumors, not speculation, his own words. A coping mechanism that, over time, reportedly became harder to control. And when you combine that with a life already filled with pressure, responsibility, and constant scrutiny, it creates a volatile environment. At the same time, Angelina Jolie was evolving in a completely different direction. More involved in humanitarian work, more politically engaged, more focused on structure, protection, and long-term stability, especially for the children. According to various reports over the years, her priorities were becoming sharper, more defined. 2 people, moving forward, but not together. And then came 2016, the private flight. This is where the story shifts from tension to rupture. What exactly happened on that plane has never been fully laid out in public. According to reports and later legal documents, there was an alleged altercation involving Pitt, Jolie, and members of the family. The situation was serious enough to trigger investigations. Authorities looked into it. Statements were taken. Details surfaced in fragments. But here is the critical point. No criminal charges were ultimately filed against Brad Pitt. The case did not move forward in that direction. And yet, the impact was immediate. Within days, Angelina Jolie filed for divorce. No long statement, no dramatic explanation. Just a decision that cut through everything they had built over more than 10 years. And suddenly, the image that once felt indestructible collapsed overnight. The world saw the headline, shock, confusion, endless speculation. But what the public saw was only the explosion, not the pressure that built it. Because moments like that do not come out of nowhere. They are the result of everything that came before, every unresolved tension, every difference pushed aside, every crack ignored. And once it happens, there's no going back, only fallout. What makes this story unsettling is not the moment it broke, but what it reveals when you start looking underneath. Because once the divorce was filed, the narrative did not become clearer. It became more fragmented, more layered, more uncomfortable. This was no longer about a single incident. It was about 2 people who may have been living in completely different realities long before everything collapsed. Angelina Jolie was often described, even by those who worked with her, as highly controlled, deeply protective, someone who does not react impulsively, but calculates, anticipates, prepares. Brad Pitt, on the other hand, would later admit to feeling disconnected from himself for years, struggling with identity, with habits he could not fully control, with a version of his life that no longer made sense to him. That difference is not just personality. That is a difference in how two people process reality. And when those two systems collide under pressure, the result is not balance, it is distortion. Then there is the question of power, not just fame, but influence. Over time, Jolie's role was expanding beyond Hollywood. She was stepping into global conversations, political spaces, humanitarian leadership. Her identity was becoming sharper, more mission-driven. Pitt, while still a massive star, seemed to be in a different phase, more introspective, more uncertain. According to some interpretations, that shift may have quietly changed the dynamic between them. Not dramatically, not overnight, but enough to create imbalance. Because in relationships like this, power is not static, it moves. And when it moves unevenly, tension follows. The family adds another layer. 6 children, each with their own history, their own needs, their own place in a life that was anything but normal. Parenting at that scale, under that level of scrutiny, is not just emotional, it is strategic. Reports over the years have suggested differences in how they approach discipline, structure, freedom. Again, nothing explosive on its own, but combined with everything else, it becomes something heavier, something that builds. And then there is the environment. Imagine trying to resolve conflict when every disagreement exists under a microscope. Every move can be leaked. Every silence becomes a headline. There is no space to fail quietly, no room to break and rebuild without the world watching. That kind of pressure does not just expose problems, it amplifies them. This is where the story becomes more difficult to simplify, because it stops being about right and wrong. It becomes about incompatibility that evolved over time. Two people who may have started aligned, driven by intensity, by purpose, by something that felt bigger than themselves, slowly moving in directions that no longer matched. And the more they tried to hold it together, the more complicated it became. And then, as the legal process began, something else happened. The story stopped belonging to them. It became public, interpreted, divided. And what was once a relationship started turning into a narrative that no one could fully control. And then, it escalated. Once the separation became public, everything shifted. This was no longer a private unraveling. It became a prolonged, highly visible conflict that refused to settle. What started as a divorce quickly expanded into something heavier. Custody battles, legal filings, statements carefully crafted yet loaded with implication. Every move analyzed, every silence questioned. And the public, once unified in admiration, began to split. Some stood with Angelina Jolie, seeing a mother protecting her children at all costs. Others leaned toward Brad Pitt, viewing a man confronting his flaws and trying to rebuild. The truth, however, did not present itself so cleanly, because behind the scenes, the situation was evolving in ways that were difficult to fully understand from the outside. Court documents surfaced over time, revealing fragments of a much more complex picture. Disagreements over custody were not just legal arguments, they carried emotional weight. According to various reports, tensions extended into how the children related to each parent, how decisions were made, how the past was interpreted. But again, much of this remained partial, filtered through filings and statements rather than a complete, unified narrative. And then there was time. Years passed, but the conflict did not fade. It stretched, it deepened. What should have been a process of separation turned into something ongoing, unresolved. That is what made it feel different. Not a clean break, but a slow, persistent fracture that refused to close. Public perception continued to shift. Early shock gave way to speculation. Speculation turned into positions. People began choosing sides, constructing their own versions of the story based on incomplete information. And the more the narrative divided, the harder it became to see the situation as it actually was. Because once a story becomes polarized, it stops being about facts. It becomes about belief. Emotionally, this is where the weight increases, because at this stage, it is no longer just about what happened. It is about what it means, about how each side frames the past, about how each decision shapes the future, not just for them, but for their children, their legacy, their identities beyond the relationship. And just when it seemed like things could not get more complicated, another layer emerged, because the real fight was not just about custody, it was about something else entirely. If the divorce was the fracture, this is where it turned into a war, because what followed was not just emotional fallout. It became strategic, legal, calculated, and far more public than either side may have originally intended. At the center of it all was something that, on the surface, seemed almost unrelated: a vineyard in the south of France, Chateau Miraval, a place once associated with celebration, with legacy, with the idea of building something lasting together. But over time, it became one of the most contested battlegrounds in their separation. According to court filings, Angelina Jolie sold her stake in the winery to an external party. Brad Pitt responded with legal action, arguing that there had been prior agreements about ownership and consent. What followed was a series of lawsuits, counterclaims, and requests for documents that pushed the conflict into a different territory. This was no longer about who gets what. It was about control, about who defines the terms of what they built together. Then came another layer: allegations tied to non-disclosure agreements. According to Jolie's legal team, she had been asked to sign agreements that would restrict what she could say regarding past incidents. She declined. Pitt's side has denied certain characterizations of these claims, and this is where the narrative becomes even more difficult to navigate, because now it is not just about actions, it is about interpretations, about what is said, what is withheld, what is legally protected from ever being fully explained. And here is the uncomfortable truth. Much of what people believe about this phase comes from fragments, legal documents, reported statements, interpretations by media outlets. There is no single, complete version of events that both sides agree on publicly, which means every perspective carries bias. Every conclusion carries uncertainty. Some see Jolie as someone refusing to be controlled, pushing back against structures that attempt to silence her. Others see Pitt as someone defending what he built, reacting to decisions made without mutual agreement. Both narratives exist, both are argued, neither fully cancels the other. And that is what makes this part of the story so unsettling, because it stops being about a relationship ending. It becomes about legacy, reputation, power, the right to tell the story, and the right to protect it. And maybe the most revealing detail is this: years later, even after the divorce itself reached a legal conclusion, these battles did not fully disappear. They continued, quietly, strategically, as if the ending never really came. And maybe it never will. At the beginning, it looked like a story about love. Intense, unconventional, almost cinematic in the way it unfolded. Two people meeting at the height of their power, building something that felt bigger than themselves. A family that symbolized unity across cultures, a relationship that seemed to redefine what Hollywood could look like. But as time passed, that story became harder to hold together. Not because it was fake, but because it was never simple. Because behind every perfect image, there are choices, compromises, tensions that do not disappear, only hide. And in the case of Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt, those tensions did not explode all at once. They built, quietly, over years, through differences in identity, in values, in how they saw the world and their place in it, until eventually something had to give. What makes this story linger is not the divorce itself, it's everything that followed. The layers that never fully settled, the questions that were never completely answered, the fact that even now, pieces of the conflict continue to surface, reshaping how people understand what happened. There is no clean narrative here, no single truth that explains everything. And maybe that is the point. Because when a relationship becomes this large, this public, this intertwined with image and expectation, the truth does not exist in one version. It exists somewhere in between, in the space between what is said and what is left unsaid,
between what is proven and what is believed. Maybe they were never meant to last, or maybe they held on longer than anyone could have under that kind of pressure. Maybe the love was real, and maybe the damage was too. But the deeper question remains, not just what went wrong, but whether it was ever possible for it to go right in the first place. If this story made you question what you thought you knew, you're not alone. Hollywood is full of narratives that look clear on the surface, but fall apart when you look closer. If you want to explore more stories like this, where image and reality collide, stay with us, because sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that never fully reveal themselves.